Welcome and thank you everyone for joining. We will begin quite shortly. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GCCM panel Enabling Positive Climate Adaptation Journeys. We all know that climate mobility is one of the most pressing issues in our area, and intensifying climate impacts from extreme weather and events and slow onset environmental degradation are already reshaping the way people move and reshaping daily life for millions of people. Projections suggest that more than 200 million people could be displaced by 2050 due to climate-related drivers, while many others might be unable to move at all. Enabling positive climate adaptation journeys on this context, whether it means staying in place or adapting locally, moving with dignity, or planning for relocation, demands cross-sectoral action that is grounded in evidence and in community priorities, that is community-led. And this is exactly what we are going to be discussing on this panel that we have for today. We're going to be focusing the first section of the panel in the Africa region, and the second section of the panel in the Greater Caribbean. For our first section of this panel, we have our GCCM colleagues, Nikki Stoneman, which is a knowledge coordinator from the Global Center for Climate Mobility. We also have our colleague, Lukman Akintola, which is a knowledge associate from GCCM, and we have our colleague Sophie Brenda, which is a GCCM Climate Mobility Fellow, Youth Fellow for GCCM. For the Greater Caribbean section, we have Emma Winkley, which is also a knowledge coordinator from GCCM. We have Roll J. Williams, a GCCM Climate Mobility Fellow, that will also be sharing and discussing some of the key findings that we're going to be presenting today. We're going to be talking about regional initiatives that we have done both in the Africa region as well as in the Greater Caribbean, as well as on a national deep dive that go a little bit deeper on findings that we have from specific country reports that we have done. Then we're going to have a section where we are going to have the opportunity to discuss some of the findings and issues that our speakers will be presenting today. So with this and with no more further ado, I give the floor to our first speaker, Nikki. Please feel free to start your presentation and show your screen.
Lukman's actually going to be kicking us off. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Estella. Thank you, colleagues. Absolutely a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers for facilitating this excellent symposium. So basically, I want to share with you our work in Africa, where we have been able to conduct a continental-wide effort, and also now we are now looking at deep dive across several countries. Myself, I would take us through the regional efforts, while my colleague Nikki would look into to take us through our deep dive work, specifically in Botswana and Uganda. Just for anybody that is not familiar, the ACMI is a joint effort that was launched in 2021 by the GCCM, the African Union, the World Bank, the UNDP, UNFCCC, and IOM. It was basically an initiative that seeks to bring together political momentum, but also bringing various stakeholders together to advance climate action, advance DRR, disaster risk reduction, also address migration and displacement, but also promote development. So basically, at the GCCM, but also looking at what we are doing at the ACMI, we are actually using four key approaches rather. So basically, we are building knowledge, and the knowledge part is one of the things I will be sharing with us today through our African Shift report. We have also been working through forging a common agenda through what we call our agenda for action. And also we are also trying to connect and empower change agents, basically through our youth efforts. Our fellowship program and also youth forum is one of our ways to connect and empower change agents. Also, we are also accelerating implementation, especially through our deep dive work on the ground. So these are basically some of our key approaches that we are leveraging at GCCM. Also, just to know, I have 15 minutes, so I have to be very careful. So that's why I'm rushing a little bit. You feel free to also say something if you think I'm going too fast. So basically, the phase one of this work started in 2021, and we launched the African Shift report at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt at COP27. And basically, that effort led to the African Shift report at the agenda for action, but more importantly, also the voices from the front line. This is the beginning of this bring out the launch of our work in the knowledge space. So now I will now take us through what we have been doing on the African Shift report. Just to know, this is the African Shift report. I'll be presenting some of the key insights for some of our participants. But if you really want to read more, you can go on our website to get it. Just to mention, this one shows that we got an award for it. You can clap for us if you want, but we actually got an award for that. So basically, from the African Shift report, what are the current realities? Basically, the current realities, and as you can see from this map, is saying that on the continent and across the world globally, you can see that the greenhouse gas emission is coming from the developed world, right? You can see China, you can see United States, you can see Australia, you can see what is going on in Europe. But when you then come to the climate risk, as you can see that Africa is basically one of the most affected continents, right? You can see quite a number of countries showing very, very red. It's showing that despite contributing very less to the greenhouse gas emission, we are really facing this disproportionately climate impact. So if this becomes a problem, but also shows that there is need to intensify climate adaptation efforts, resilience efforts, and also limits vulnerability across communities on the continent. Now, basically, like we all know, climate change rather is affecting livelihood mobility patterns across the continent. And from the IDMC reports that was launched earlier this year, it shows that 7.8 million people were displaced in 2024, and this is an increase for what we saw in 2023. But across this, something is very, very common. Drought, flood, and storm are some of the leading drivers. So this means that for flood, you can see that majority of the coastal areas are basically experiencing climate stresses. But when you go to some of the dry land and arid areas on the continent, the drought is becoming a major problem. So quite a number of pastoralist community, coastal and informal settlements are very vulnerable to the devastating impact of climate stresses. So, and of course, this is causing forced displacement and even either immobility, but also mobility patterns as well. So for us at GCCM, we set out and we to get insights across the continent, and we we gather our work across 6 countries in Senegal, Lagos, Angola, Malawi, Mozambique, Uganda, and Egypt. And in engaging people, this is the framework we use. As you can see, we try to look at what are the we try to look at what are the key stressors that are making people to move. Is this largely climate stressors? What are other stressors, either socioeconomic? What is the migration outcome? Either voluntary mobility, and all that. So this is just showing the framework that we use to ask our questions when we went on the field, when working on to understand the the intersection between climate change and human mobility patterns on the continent. And these are some of our findings. As you can see that something that stands for us, basically, you can see that across all the 6 countries that we surveyed, 54.5 people do not really want to move. They don't want to leave their homes. So it shows that while we are talking about climate mobility, immobility is also extremely important for us. That is people's right to stay in their homes, in their communities, and on their land. So, but also for people that really want to move, as you can see, 23.3% are considering moving, but they lack the resources. So if they really want to move, and these are some of the things that actually is driving us to say that for people that really want to move, how can we support them? And something that we also find very interesting is that climate change is not the only drivers. There are also other drivers. As you can see, there are drivers around other social and economic drivers that are making people to move. So we can't only say that climate change is the only driver, but other socioeconomic activities are pulling people to explore mobility as a means of survival in the face of climate stresses. So what are the projections? I think this is very important for us to note that everyone understand what the current state is, what will it look like in the future if we do not act on time. Don't forget, this is just projections. It might not happen if we do the right thing. So in determining our projections, we basically leverage the gravity model, a model that helps us understand population distributions, but also we work with the assumption that larger places, either urban areas, schools, jobs, and places that have better amenities attract people. We also work with the assumption that also availability of resources, better water access, crop production, attract people, but also conflicts make people leave some certain place. So these are some of the assumptions we work with. But something that also very important is that in determining climate mobility, right? We in determining population distribution rather, we actually work with as you can see this first cube, it says the population distribution. The other one talk about places that attract them, and putting these two together would actually show where people will likely move to because of either climate change serving as a driver, and also other socioeconomic realities bringing people in to where they're going to. So this is just to tell you an idea of how we determine hotspot areas in terms of where people will move into and where they will live. So also something that we find very crucial is to also mention that, as you can see from this globe, it's just showing the grid cells that we work with, 10 by 10 kilometers. So we did not work with 5 by 5. We're already seeing some models. So we also have room for improvement. But for now, we work with 10 by 10 kilometers grid cells. As you can also see, the SSPs, which is also the socioeconomic pathways, is just talking about the development patterns. So in determining our climate mobility in terms of where people move to, we will use SSPs, which is socioeconomic pathways. On the other hand, we also use the representative consultation pathway, which is the pathways that determine where greenhouse gas emission in terms of determining climate change, in terms of climate drivers. So we then bring the climate and the socioeconomic driver, we bring them together. That then help us to understand where people are likely to move to because of climate change and socioeconomic realities. So as we can also see, we compare that there is a situation where there is no climate, but also a situation where there is climate impact. So all these things help us understand climate mobilities in terms of where people will move to, but also some of the drivers that are pushing people. So this is just a bit of explanation around how we come about our projections. But just to also understand better, we are working with when we say R 6.0, we are basically talking about high emission scenario. When we talk about 2.6, we are talking about low emissions. So for this presentation, you will hear me talk about high road and rocky road. So basically, there are situations where we have high emissions. Under high road is talking about high emission and inclusive development, while rocky road is talking about high emission and unequal development. So as you can see from the continental view, please, how many minutes do I have more? I can see the timing.
You have 5 or more minutes.
Thank you. So as you can see from the continent, you can see from the legend, you can see that when it's anywhere where you see the red, there are places where origin areas, while green are the destination areas. But from you can see that across all these places, people are moving in and out due to climate change, right? And this one is showing internal mobility, not cross-border. So we are basically focusing around internal mobility here. But something that really struck us is to see that across the Sahel belt, you can see that there's a lot of mobility coming up, but also in the coastal areas and border areas. So it's something for us to note as well. And from what we have that up to 1.113 million people might likely move internally by 2020, by 2050. So, and under Rocky Road scenario, this shows that if we do not do the right thing, if we don't have the right, if we leave it as business as usual, we are likely to have a lot of people on the move because of climate pressure. But of course, with the interaction with other socioeconomic realities. But also, what we also have here is to show that on cross-border, we can see that under high road scenario, we have 12.5 million people on cross-border for other reasons. But you can see that climate is just saying less than 1 million. But when you look at also the same thing under rocky road, you can see 11 million for other reasons. But climate is only causing less than 500 million, 500,000 rather. What this is saying is that more people would move internally and very less people will move across border because of climate change. So it is to tell all of us, to show us that less cross-border mobility, but more of internal mobility because of climate change. And it will show that we have a lot of work to do to ensure that we support people if they want to move and if they want to stay in their home countries. And based on all this work, we came up with the agenda for action. We have 8 of them. But something that is very crucial, especially for this gathering, across them is, if you can see, is to say action 1, which is to anticipate and plan. I know we have a lot of researchers on this call. It is extremely important for us to work on evidence-based research and to ensure that we can leverage our work to drive anticipation and plan for climate displacement or even migration on the continent. And there are other ones as well that we can build from local and resilient. So this is basically where I will stop, and I will leave it to my colleague, Nikki, to actually move us to the deep dive work. Over to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Lukman. Very helpful framing. So as Lukman said in the beginning, the way that we structure our initiatives, our regional initiatives, is by doing regional level modeling and evidence gathering on the ground and looking at those together. And then at the second level, which the result of which was an African Shifts report, which he spoke of. And then the second level of our work is going down to the national level and trying to analyze that regional information at the country level so it can be useful for governments and for stakeholders at the national level. And then the third level being getting it down to the community. But looking at the national deep dives that we're currently working on, I wanted to highlight 2 that are at a stage, at a more advanced stage, so you can see a little bit of the results and how that regional data looks at the national level on the ground. Lukman, can you go to the next one? So the deep dive stages, what we start off with is trying to localize that continental knowledge that I spoke of and develop a country profile that uses other literature review as well, but so governments can understand the full spectrum of climate mobility going on in their country from what we're seeing in our research. And then we do consultations with governments and stakeholders, and in the end, developing a blueprint for action to address and harness climate mobility, both of which have been developed for Uganda and Botswana. So I'm going to first start talking about the deep dive that we've been doing in Botswana, where we just did consultations in March, and now moving on to the blueprint. The really important takeaway here, looking at the different origin and destination countries, one being that internal mobility is much more prevalent in the climate mobility context. But in terms of cross-border mobility, we see that more people are projected to come to Botswana than leave the country, and that cross-border mobility is projected to be quite low. The main country of origin would be into Botswana would be Zimbabwe, and South Africa is projected to be the biggest destination for people leaving due to climate factors. In terms of internal climate mobility projections, we do modeling projections up until 2050, which Lukman spoke about. And so these climate impacts are expected to push up to 30,000 people, which is more than 1% of the population, to move internally. And maybe 1% seems small, but those 30,000 people are also concentrated in really important sectors. So it's affecting different livelihoods and sectors. So it is a big number at the end of the day. In terms of urban areas, I think there is a graph missing here. But in terms of the urban centers, we see a lot of convergence in the urban centers. There's a lot of different issues conflating in the urban areas because there's a lot of stress on different resources and infrastructure. And urban centers are projected to be adversely affected by climate impacts, as we can imagine. But we see these different hotspots emerging as early as 2030. We're doing projections up until 2030 and also up until 2050. And we see that the east and southeast of Botswana will be the most affected by population shifts in response to the climate change impacts. And this is under the projections prior were from the Rocky Road scenario, which is kind of the worst case scenario, high emissions mixed with low development. And if you're looking at the, stay there. The urban climate mobility projections, by 2050, we see that Botswana's, the urban areas in aggregate are projected to see a lot of people leave due to climate impacts. And then despite those projections, even though people are going to leave due to climate impacts and the intensity of those climate impacts, whether it's on economic livelihoods or stress or looking for different resources, we're seeing that out mobility in Mon, in Francistown, and Kanye. These cities are still going to see a continuation of population growth, meaning more people could be exposed to climate risk, because this doesn't mean these numbers aren't separated from the population growth that's already occurring. So it's an important thing to remember when looking at projections of ours and like these, that this is in line with other migration flows, other population growth, what's happening already, and then inclusive of climate change. Looking at Uganda next, this is a photo from our consultations. What we're seeing in Uganda is that a lot more stark impact. Uganda is already seeing shifts in movement patterns due to climate change. Everyone we speak to is already seeing this on the ground. We have our fellow here from Uganda who can share more. And we see that drought a lot is causing conflict between pastoralists and farmers, especially the drought in the past couple of years in East Africa affected a lot of people, fighting for resources. In terms of temporary and immediate displacements, the pastoralists and farmers is kind of long-term mobility, traditional patterns changing over time, depending on resources. But we also see flooding and landslides are causing internal displacement where people have to leave immediately and they're relocated to another area. And oftentimes these are government mandated and not really done in consultation with the communities, or they're done too fast and people are connected to their ancestral homes, so they end up returning in the end. So it's causing a lot of kind of temporary displacements. And then we also see that rural to urban migration as a means of diversifying income. When people see their livelihoods threatened, their more agricultural or pastoral livelihoods threatened, they may be going to more urban areas as a means to diversify income from economic stress. And so we see by 2050, up to 3.6 of Uganda's population could be on the move due to climate impacts, a larger percentage than we saw in Botswana. This is again with the Rocky Road scenario, the low development and high emissions. But we see that the majority will be internal, and this holds true in many of the cases that we study. We see that internal climate migrants in Uganda could multiply by 5, from about 500,000 in 2020 up to 5.1 million in 2050. And that's under the high emissions and equitable development scenario. Under more the high road scenario, so being high emissions but also high development, this could reduce down to 3.5 million. So I think that shows that this will still have an impact, but it could be less dire. And we see that climate out mobility in terms of cross-border will contribute to about 17% of the total likely cross-border migration. So just noting that cross-border migration will be happening anyway. Uganda is a big receptor of refugees in the region, and they host a lot of refugees, I think the largest host of refugees. And so all of these things are combined together, but climate mobility is going to still account for a good percentage of that cross-border migration. Kenya being the biggest destination for climate migrants who are moving out of Uganda, so in the border countries. We'll also see the borderlands in Uganda and around East Africa see a lot of displacement. This is also related to pastoralists who move between the countries anyway. But then coming into Uganda, it would be the majority from places from other parts of Africa that are not bordering, which could be likely due to the other conflicts in the region. Go ahead. We also see that spatially, we see a shift from Western to Eastern Uganda. People will be moving mainly due to water availability and crop production. So wherever they see more water availability, they'll go there, better chance of a crop turnout. We see arrival hotspots arriving in Mbale, Mount Elgon, Kampala, Ntungamo, and the Karamoja region could emerge as arrival hotspots. And we see out migration hotspots around the lakes and the rain-fed lowlands because with drought and things, some of their livelihoods and crop availability could be changing. And we also see in urban areas, we're looking at how if we have an inequitable future, so this high emissions and an inequitable development, this would allow less people to leave these high-risk urban areas. So in 12 of Uganda's largest cities, as I said before, populations are going to continue to grow regardless, more than 10%, despite the ongoing climate mobility out of those cities. So even though there will be a number of people leaving, they're still going to grow from other trends in population growth. And it's not really projected to force a decline in the total population of these cities. But that being said, that means that a lot of people are going to be stuck in high-risk areas if there's not equitable solutions for them or ways for them to be able to leave. So it's also something to consider. Even if people aren't moving, they're still at risk of the challenges of climate mobility, or we can harness them for solutions. And I just wanted to end it here with a little sharing from the consultations, because in line with the literature review and the data modeling, we also consulted with many people. And so the consultations really confirmed all of our findings and found that climate mobility in Uganda needs a whole of society approach. Everybody needs to be involved, from stakeholders, from affected communities, from the government, and that current climate policies at this moment don't integrate climate mobility. We are working with the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda to work on these policies, on their national action plans, on their nationally determined contributions. So a lot is happening, but at this moment, it's not fully integrated. And we see that while people are experiencing it in their lives, the direct impacts of climate change, there's kind of low climate literacy levels, or people aren't able to articulate it or connect those dots to human mobility. So their lived experience is expert experience, but being able to articulate it and understand what can happen in the future can really help people make decisions that are best for them and give them agency. And we see a lot of local initiatives already addressing this. And yeah, that I will end here and pass it over to my colleagues who will introduce the Caribbean initiative, which mirrors the work we did in Africa, but of course, different in context. Thank you.
Nikki, before moving on to the Greater Caribbean, we are going to allow our
Oh, right,
colleague
yeah.
Sophie to share and discuss some insights on the work that we have done in the African region. So, Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Estella, and hi everyone. Thank you so much for listening in to Lukman and Nikki presenting the African region and Uganda and Botswana. Well, maybe let me start by dwelling on to what Nikki has highlighted in at the end of her presentation as one of the major findings that the GCCM did in the consultations that they had, and maybe expound on that the consultations actually found that there was need for involvement of the communities in climate mobility planning. And again, in one of her examples where she gave that in cases of displacement, when floods or any of these climate impacts happen, communities actually end up going back into their usual areas after at the end when it has all cooled down. And I just want also to share an example where lack of community engagement has created issues. In one of the projects that happened, that was being carried out, that is the local climate adaptation, adaptive living project, local project. There was an incident where in one of the districts, we had to have, there had to be like community consultations, but that did not happen. And so because the road kept on, the river kept on bursting and the road would get flooded. And so farmers could not bring their produce into the cities to sell, and that brought about livelihood disruptions. So when this project came up, the district planners just went and they were like, okay, we need to channel this river into another area. So without consulting the community, the river was channeled, and then they ended up cutting off the lower community that was depending on the river for agriculture. So this is just to highlight that the findings of GCCM are actually very valid in Uganda, and that community engagement is very important in carrying out climate mobility planning or adaptation planning, because it creates ownership of these projects and also kind of brings about sustainability. Secondly, maybe I discuss about another thing I would like to highlight is the involvement of youth in climate mobility planning, which the GCCM has quite spearheaded, working in Uganda with organizations promoting work of youth organizations like the Aba Youth, which is having a number of projects in areas that are affected by floods in southern Uganda. So I would like to stop there, and back to you, Estella.
Thank you, Sophie. Your perspective being from Uganda is certainly valuable. It's just a shame that we are really tight on time, but thank you to all of the colleagues that have shared information on the very important issues that we have found throughout our national and regional initiatives. We will now move on to our section that focuses on the regional and national studies that GCCM has done and continues to engage on in the Greater Caribbean region. And for that, we have the first presentation on the regional GCCMI, and we have Emma Winkley that is going to talk to us about that. Emma, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Stella. I'm just going to share my screen now. Great. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to my colleagues for the great overview of our work in the African region, as well as in some of the national contexts that we've worked in. I recognize that we have a lot of back-to-back presentations in this session that cover quite a bit of information. So I will try to keep my my intervention super to the point and brief, and can hopefully answer any questions that might come up along the way. So as Estella introduced, I'll be presenting the results of the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative, which is the regional work that we did in the Greater Caribbean. This, in terms of structure, this is similar to what my colleague Lukman presented for the African region. It is an initiative carried out by the GCCM, as well as the Association of Caribbean States and a number of UN partners, as well as the World Bank. And I want to highlight importantly that when we talk about the Greater Caribbean, it's a region that really it combines numerous other subregions in Latin America and the Caribbean. And when I talk through some of the results, primarily of the modeling projections that were carried out, I talk about the regional level results. I am talking about the 25 member states that are members to the Association of Caribbean States. So those are 25 countries that border the Caribbean Sea. And I'll show you, of course, a map to help highlight the geographic scope of this project. So I will begin by, I think, first talking through just a bit about who we are as GCCMI, the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative. We are structured very much in the same way as the ACMI that Lukman presented, so I won't spend a ton of time here. But essentially, our work aims to enable action at the nexus of climate change, disaster risk reduction, development, and human mobility. And we engage in this way by creating an evidence base that includes both modeling projections to give possible futures, as well as field work. We then take this and translate it into agenda for actions and agendas for action, and then take the regional level findings and distill them down to the national level. So exactly the same model as my colleagues just presented in Africa, just in the Caribbean instead. I'll start by, and just as a quick mention, everything that I'm going to present today is a highly condensed version of the what is all of our published findings in the Great Caribbean Shifts report. So if you would like to read more and to engage with this topic more in depth, I recommend that you visit the website, and you can actually download the report there, which will give further details to my presentation. I'll begin with an overview of our fieldwork findings that help to illustrate the current realities of both climate change and mobility experiences in 6 countries across the Greater Caribbean region. So our fieldwork teams, and including my colleague Nikki Stuman, who we have on the call, so she's an excellent person to ask if you have any questions about the fieldwork. But this was carried out in 14 communities across 6 countries in the Greater Caribbean, including 3 mainland countries and 3 Caribbean island countries. So the field sites were chosen based on different profiles. So on their climate profile, their social and economic activity profiles, as well as their mobility profiles, whether they are places of origin, places of destination, or also places of transit. And these factors were all kept in mind in order to get different perspectives from people that were considering moving, those that had already moved, and those that had stayed in place. The visualizations that I will be showing on today's slides, such as this one here, come from primarily the surveys that were carried out. So I think our fieldwork teams carried out over 2,200 surveys across the 14 communities that I highlighted. So to get into some of the results, I'm sure it's not surprising to anyone on this call that climate change is a lived reality in the Greater Caribbean. I'm not sure if anyone is aware of the news, but we do have actually a Category 5 hurricane coming through the Caribbean Sea, primarily geared towards Jamaica at the current moment. So we, from our field work, we found that 75% of survey respondents see the impacts of climate change in their daily lives. This includes both sudden onset events such as flooding and hurricanes, but also slower changes like air temperature change, oceanic change, precipitation changes. The top reported impacts to individuals and to the household from these climate changes were actually really what we would consider as non-economic losses and damages, specifically to human health. So the top reported across the region impacts from climate change was impacts to mental health, specifically emotional well-being and stress levels. This was followed by impacts to physical health. And these were the top reported impacts across the national level in the Caribbean islands and Colombia. And then in Costa Rica and Jamaica, the top reported impacts at the national level were actually to more economic losses, such as livelihood losses or income losses, or to food security. However, despite these, accumulating negative experiences with the environment and the climate around them, most people that we surveyed indicated that they have no desire or plans to move. This suggested to our research team that people have a very strong attachment to place and really prefer adaptation options that allow them to stay in place and maintain their homes. And this is even true for people that are even displaced temporarily from, specifically, our teams talked to people that were displaced temporarily from flooding. Those people often return and rebuild rather than moving away permanently. For this reason, mobility, including migration or relocation, is seen as an option of last resort. You'll see that category of respondents that I described having no desire or plans to move corresponds to this yellow color here on this bar chart. So you'll see that was strongest in places like Costa Rica and least strong in places in Colombia. And while some people described having, again, this really strong attachment to place through particularly their cultural identity, their spiritual or heritage identity, or their actual livelihood or means to make an income, other people explained that they actually had the desire to move but were unable to. And I'll just go briefly back to the previous slide where you can see, previously on this slide, you can see that the people that wanted to move but felt unable to corresponds to this light blue color. And this was strongest in places like Colombia. And we did an analysis of some of the factors that might be contributing to this inability to move. And we showed that it was likely, in some variables popped up, such as gender. Women were 10% more likely to want to move than men. And also there was some evidence to suggest that people who had moved in the past were also felt unable to move in the future. And then also in some countries, the financial status and having less financial security contributed to wanting to stay in place. All that is to say, though, that the people that were considering moving, were considering future movement, of those people, 40% responded that they would actually consider climate change in those decisions. So despite this overall arching desire to mostly remain, we do see that climate impacts pop up as a influence on decision making, on mobility decision making in several of the communities that we surveyed. So now, against that backdrop of what is currently happening, I'll move into some of the future projections for the Caribbean region. I will note that the model works slightly differently than the model used in Africa, so please take that into consideration. This model is a global model of the world economy, so it really looks at the economic impetus or economic basis for movement. It suggests that when the climate change impacts different layers of the world economy, including these 4 different dimensions: production, consumption, labor markets, and international trade, that will either impact people's ability to move, making them more mobile, or their ability to stay, making them more immobile. The model can tell us all these different types of information, including disaggregated data by age categories, gender categories, and education categories. It looks at different climate scenarios, just as the ACMI model does, and the results I'll be quickly going through are primarily for what we deemed as the worst case scenario for the Greater Caribbean region, which is considered the regional rivalry scenario. So when you hear me say the Rocky Road scenario, it is a scenario that is primarily focused on a world in which there is less international cooperation on things like climate mitigation and social and economic development, and a world in which emissions exceed or raise global temperatures above 2 degrees Celsius. So just to get through some of this quickly, so our model tells us at the very basis that we will have some shifting economic opportunities in the Greater Caribbean. Overall, the region as a whole could lose up to 20% of its GDP per capita. However, these impacts will not be evenly distributed, as you can see here on the on the map, where the brightest pink or coral color pixels are the places with the most damage. Some places can even exceed up to 50% of losses per capita. And when these economic impacts shift where jobs are available, the model tells us that people will likely move. So you see here that the map actually the map of net mobility actually corresponds quite directly with the map of economic change. And we see that as jobs shift, up to 8.2 million adults in the Greater Caribbean can move permanently. And I just want to also caution against this model shows permanent movement only and does not show short-term displacement. It also only shows regular economic mobility rather than anything that is not regularized or is undocumented. The model projects that more than 60% of this movement will happen internally. And this is quite in keeping with what we also see in Africa, where the primary mobility response to climate impacts happens within country borders rather than across country borders. However, of the just under 40% that will go abroad to places like the United States, Canada, and Spain, most will settle in the United States. You see here that there's a much more significant proportion, mainly due to historic mobility routes that will draw people to the United States. We also get some information on climate drivers, including and see that temperature rise and disaster impacts will be the most significant drivers of mobility across the region, accounting for about 80% of this mobility. And I will say that sea level rise pops up as a very significant driver in some countries, specifically the Bahamas, where it accounts for 90% of the out mobility from the Bahamas. And I see that I'm almost at time here, so I'm going to need to wrap up. But the last thing that the model shows us is that people will not only be induced to move at higher rates in the Greater Caribbean, but they will also be induced to stay at higher rates. And it shows us that up to 6 million people could be actually deterred from moving by 2050 because of the fact that places that people would have moved to in a world without climate change will actually have less economic opportunity in a world with climate change. So it's actually because of the effect on potential destinations that deters people from moving and pushes them to stay into place. This is really important for policymakers trying to ensure that social and economic development in places of origin can make sure that there's social safety nets for the people that stay. And specifically, we note that because poverty could increase, that addressing the underlying drivers of poverty is could be a very big challenge for these places. So I will stop there and just summarize the fact that we then took all of these results and we moved it into just a agenda for action, which I can just briefly show you, using stakeholder consultations to prioritize key actions for addressing climate mobility in this region. You can read more about these key actions on our website, which I encourage all of you to go to and read through further. I'm sorry for being a minute over. Thank you so much for your time. I will now pass the floor to my colleague Rolje, who will give a overview of our first deep dive in the Greater Caribbean. So just as a brief context, the GCCMI is a little bit less evolved than the ACMI. So we've only been able to work at the country level in one country so far, and that is Rolje's home country of St. Kitts and Nevis. So I will stop there and pass the floor to him.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on the climate mobility deep dive, which happened in St. Kitts and Nevis in May 2025. So the GCCM embarked on this deep dive in collaboration with the government of St. Kitts and Nevis. And in this initiative, we engaged local government, traditional and faith leaders, youth and youth service providers, elderly people and service providers for elders, women, migrants, including harder to reach groups such as Dominicans, Haitians, and Cubans in St. Kitts and Nevis, residents of coastal communities, farmers, residents of Guts, and for a bit of context, Guts in St. Kitts and Nevis refer to riverine areas, tiny rivers that pass through villages, and finally, healthcare providers. And so my involvement in the deep dive came particularly in stage 2, which involved consultations with the national government partners and the local stakeholders that I mentioned before. And this consultation involved a policy workshop, which is the first activity, where we met with government stakeholders, institutional stakeholders, technocrats, and experts on the environment and climate change and climate action in St. Kitts and Nevis. And on the policy side, we sought to examine the existing framework in St. Kitts and Nevis and how it addresses or does not address climate mobility. And we had technocrats from different ministries and people who are in charge of NGOs that advocate for climate action. Then on the community side, we wanted to see how people perceive and act on climate risk. And these perceptions and ideas were then compiled into the Blueprint for National Development, which is the stage 3 of the deep dive implementation process in St. Kitts and Nevis. And in terms of some of the perceptions that we got out of this, we found that people were generally aware of climate change and what it is and its risks. We found that participants thought that youth were more knowledgeable on climate change simply because they were more technologically connected. They receive information in real time from social media. They're more likely to follow web pages that speak about the impacts of climate change, whereas other generations might rely on government sources and traditional media sources for their information on climate change. And we also found that participants could outline the socioeconomic impacts of climate change quite easily. We found this in our District 7 discussion and in the Nevis discussion, particularly where we had a list of issues that people could relate to the impacts of climate change in St. Kitts and Nevis. We also found that participants were more likely to attribute the risks and impacts of climate change to issues such as infrastructure, which is primarily a governmental issue in St. Kitts and Nevis, although they could list the climate hazards such as extreme heat, altered rainfall patterns, etc. And this came out quite strongly in our District 7 consultation, where the community members identified that, yes, they've been getting significantly more rainfall in that part of St. Kitts, but they felt that the government had an obligation or a mandate to fix the drainage issues that they found in that particular community. So on the topic of mobility, participants viewed St. Kitts and Nevis as a destination country, and factors such as St. Kitts and Nevis having the highest minimum wage in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States came out, and the fact that the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States has a free movement mechanism, which allows citizens of its 8 member countries to move between the islands with just a basic ID, such as a driver's license, and you could work and enjoy social benefits because of that. But conversely, participants thought that youth leave in droves to seek educational and economic opportunities. So because there are a limited number of tertiary education facilities in St. Kitts and Nevis, for example, to obtain a university education, you most likely have to leave. And they thought that because of this, youth are more likely to remain overseas in search of better opportunities, better economic opportunities. And we also found that there is still some reluctance among the people that we asked in these consultations to move, and they were much more likely to mention that they'd rather stay in place and adapt rather than to relocate. And this was not just relocate to other countries, but also internal relocations. And when we surveyed the people from Old Road, which is a coastal community in District 4 of St. Kitts, the community members who live along the shoreline identified that they know that they're at risk of storm surge, they know they're at risk of hurricanes, etc., and flooding, but they'd much rather stay in place, or if they do have to move in the event of a hurricane, for example, they'd move inland temporarily and then return to their home, which is precariously on the edge of the ocean at this point in time. And part of the reason for this reluctance comes from the sense of property ownership and ancestral ties to land. And this was quite strong in Nevis, where land ownership has been a big issue for decades, where people feel tied to the land. A lot more people own land in Nevis than they do in St. Kitts. And they thought that this was something that ties them to their land, regardless of the impacts of climate change. So that is definitely something to consider in terms of our adaptation and going forward in terms of resilience and how government would include the blueprint for development, which I'll speak about later, in their ideas for infrastructural development. And then in terms of adaptation and resilience, I had the sort of benefit of being a part of the deep dive, becoming a youth fellow, and then also seeing the implementation rollout of CCAF in St. Kitts and Nevis, Communities Climate Adaptation Facility. And I'd say that it's almost a perfect alignment of things, because in our consultations, we identified that community members wanted to stay in place, wanted to adapt. And the CCAF achieves just that, where it allows locally led adaptation efforts in fisheries, agriculture, food security, and just general infrastructural resilience in St. Kitts and Nevis. And then on the sort of policy and governmental side, you have the Joint Readiness Proposal and the Blueprint for Development, which would guide the government's decision-making in respect to agriculture, housing, infrastructure, and ensuring that these are much more resilient to withstand the impacts of climate change in St. Kitts and Nevis. And so I suppose I could also speak about one example of locally led adaptation that came out of the CCAF, which actually started in the deep dive consultation, because several of the participants who are now part of the CCAF process attended that particular community consultation, where it's in the north of Nevis. You have a fisher village called the Newcastle Bay Fisher Village, and several years ago, they created this fisher village several feet back from the shoreline, and thought it would be resilient to withstand the effects of storms, etc. But over time, that has degraded, and it's now time to update the lockers and ensure that they're much more resilient. And so that's one of the projects that we received as part of the CCAF applications, and which was rolled out and showcased at the Climate Mobility Summit in New York last month. And so it's part of the broader issue of resilience for our country, because it addresses food security through fisheries. And of course, as an island state, we're very dependent on the sea for our food. So I think this is just sort of the connection of what happens when locally led initiatives are rolled out through initiatives such as the CCAF. And then to speak very briefly on the involvement of youth in these initiatives, I think, Estella, during our Climate Mobility Summit, I spoke very briefly on this and said that, to my mind, a lot of the initiatives that are rolled out on climate action, climate advocacy, are led by youth. And I also want to use the specific example of St. Kitts and Nevis, where I think young people are leading the charge in our adaptation efforts and resilience efforts. And it is through initiatives such as the fellowship, where we're able to connect with other youth and to inform them of the impacts of climate change and the realities of climate mobility, and to bring them into our projects to lead in design, implementation, etc. And I'm sorry. Yes. And so I think it is always important for us to factor in youth into discussion. We did it with our deep dive, where we allowed young people to take a very central part of our discussion, and they were able to provide brilliant solutions to what we wanted to achieve in our deep dive. So I'll stay there for now. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Roger, again, for this very insightful presentation and discussion of the findings. Thank you to you too, Emma. We will now begin our Q&A session, and I would actually like to address the first question to Sophie, because Roger, one of the last things that you mentioned was on the role of youth. And considering that Sophie is a youth fellow from GCCM, I would love to get your perspective, Sophie, on what practical ways and opportunities do you think and do you see in your context to engage youth in climate and climate mobility action?
Thank you, Estella. From the narration Roger has just given us, I could say that, first of all, youth have a lot of energy, passion, imagination that they bring to the table. But for there to be sustainable climate mobility planning or climate action adaptation, youth need to be given tools such as training to be aware of how to handle climate mobility. They also need to be given mentorship in order to lead, to use their energy to lead and take up leadership or even decision making. So to answer you precisely, I would say youth need to be involved at every stage of climate action. That is in planning. They need to be involved in drawing designs. If there is a relocation that needs to be done, youths need to be involved because they're the ones going to be present in the future. If we talk about 30 years from today, it's the youths that are going to be present. So to create ownership and sustainability, they need to be involved in that stages, but then also implementation. So if once the youths have been trained, for example, the current fellowship, the Climate Mobility Fellowship, after receiving the training that that we get after being empowered with all the knowledge and skills, to influence policy, to carry out adaptation actions, there also needs to be financing. So that is the final one. But financing without the other tools I've just mentioned would not make much impact as if finance has been given to the youths with these other tools. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophie. And you're touching on an issue that is key, and it's on providing resources. That part of enabling, it's providing resources, whether it is in a physical manner or as financing or as training and education as well. So very, very important, Sophie. Thank you. We have a question on the chat. We have other questions, but I want to address this one on the chat. And it says environmental migration is a complex phenomenon, and gravity models are often rely on various assumptions. This person is asking if we can discuss the limitations of these models, of the gravity models that we use both for ACMI and GCCMI, and how these assumptions and data constraints may have influenced our projections. So I will firstly give the floor to Lukman to respond to this question.
Thank you so much, Estella, and thank you to the questionnaire. So basically, I would answer by saying that there are quite a number of room for improvement from the model. I think one, like I mentioned earlier, one of the room for improvement would be it could be better if we use 1 by 1 kilometers from the grid cells. So as I said earlier, we currently have 5 by 5 kilometer grid cells, meaning that if we come a little bit smaller, and we are already seeing quite a number of effort around that, you can get more accuracy around mobility patterns. But also from our gravity model, we currently do not have extreme heat in it at the moment, so which is something that can actually improve it. If we have extreme heat, it can also give us better accuracy. But also when you look at the, because it's a regional effort, so we currently do not have specific drivers and specific context of all at country level, right? So meaning that when we, for instance, when we are deep dive countries, we are localizing that continental knowledge. But it could be better if we then go on the ground to then bring that model to reflect every reality on the ground. So these are some of the things that could also improve the model projections. But of course, like I said, this is an initial effort, and at CCM as well, we are also looking forward to improve and also working with partners to actually improve some of these efforts. A good example is, for instance, we have a work in Egypt where we are also looking to improve specifically around ensuring extremity is added to this effort. So this is some of the things that could improve it as well. But strongly, for us, it is an initial effort that can actually improve as we move ahead and see new effort in place. I don't know if I'm able to answer that, but that's basically in short. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Lukman, and to the participants who asked this question. Our colleague Andrea Milan is also recommending you to check, and all the participants, a website that it's a paper that looks at the pros and the cons of different modeling approaches, including the gravity approach, that is the one that we used. So a recommendation to all of our attendees to go and look at that paper if you're interested on this subject particularly. I would also like to ask a question, and I will address this to both Emma and Nikki. On this panel, we're trying to focus on how to enable positive adaptation journeys, how to actually get support to those in the front lines. And I would like to ask to you both, how does support looks like in practice, both for those who want or need to move, and for those who stay as well. And if you have any concrete examples on how are positive pathways being enabled in practice, that would be great. So I will first perhaps open the floor to Emma to respond.
Thank you so much, Estella, for this question. I honestly think I might pass it to Nikki to respond first, if that's okay. I think Nikki, feel free to draw on the field work, and then maybe I can come in with some thoughts from the deep dive work in St. Kitts.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I think, there's a difference in the way that we're seeing it play out on the ground and what we see people doing already in terms of adaptation and what they do want. And then there's another level to the more structural support that we see needing. And I think Emma can touch on the full agenda for action that we've proposed is a way more structural overhaul of like policies and climate financing, at an international and global scale. But on the ground, a lot of adaptations and positive adaptations journeys that we see people wanting is, there's a debate in the field of whether migration is an adaptation or not. And what we found is that it can be, it not always is. Some people see it as kind of a failure, or that they're departing their homeland, or that they can't return. It's not their ideal, but for some people, it can be an adaptation. And some of the ways we're seeing that is by temporary migration, people sending remittances back or going for temporary agricultural work and coming back. And that is kind of a way to maintain home. And for them, that's the adaptation they need. They need to be able to continue that temporary work in any way they can to be able to keep some kind of link to their home. We see different adaptation journeys in terms of relocations. I think this is really important, which we've seen across, the Caribbean and Africa, where people are wanting to rebuild their homes. For example, we saw in the Caribbean, people moving their houses to be higher, or different structures. But what they really need in order to be enabled to have those adaptations journey, to have the agency to decide to migrate or not, is equitable access to resources. And I think that is the issue that we see, and we see it in Uganda as well. As I said, people are relocated, and then they're on a land where they can't really farm anymore, or do things that are of their traditional practice. And so they go back to building homes in the unsustainable way that they were doing it, or just trying to get back to their homes. And so I think having equitable access means that those people who are the most vulnerable, who don't have access to kind of social resources, are the ones that are going to be the most affected. We saw in Caribbean mainland countries and in the islands that formal settlements, in the Bahamas, like whether it's Haitian migrants who don't feel comfortable reporting themselves or being a part of government systems or services because for fear of being deported. We see that with Venezuelans in Colombia living in informal settlements who don't have access to water and regular drainage systems. Then they're affected by illness. And so I think the the solution, if I don't have a solution, but it's a larger question, but it's really about making sure there's equitable access to resources for hosting communities, for communities that stay, and for communities on the move while they're on the move and when they arrive in the new place.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks,
Nikki.
Nikki. And maybe just because you've now given me a bit of extra time to think and I can reflect on what you've already said, I think I won't even add many more examples, but I'll maybe just try to distill some of the key messages from the examples that you've just provided so eloquently. But I think it makes me think about one, the fact that people are responding on their own. They don't need anyone to come in and tell them to respond to climate change. They are responding, and what it comes down to is really understanding if they are happy with the response that they have, like the example that Nikki gave, where moving away temporarily or seasonally is a response that, maybe people in some places might not want to have to do, but in others, it's deeply culturally embedded, and it's a response to evolving environmental and climate impacts that will just continue to happen because has taken hold in the community. So it is, are they happy with the responses that they're already carrying out, and how can that be supported? And the steps that you'll see in the agenda for action across the regional level is, in order to make that happen, are just dialogue. It's bringing in community members into decision making at different scales. So it's how to support things that are already underway most of the time. And then I think the other thing, and it makes me think about the session that I actually moderated yesterday about the post-displacement context, and the post-relocation and post-mobility context, is understanding what do people actually value about their homes. I think what I've taken away from a lot of our work is that support isn't gonna work if it doesn't actually bring out or empower or enable the ways that people already value the place that they live in. Just a brief example from St. Kitts and Nevis, and then I'll pass it over to back to you, Estella, for additional questions. Is in St. Kitts and Nevis, there was a relocation that happened away from basically a coastal retreat program that happened, just moving several homes away from the shoreline. And unfortunately, Roll J had to drop off, but he and our colleagues there can tell us that people largely continued to use the initial dwellings, the dwellings that were considered at risk and that people relocated from were left intact, and people use those dwellings as second homes, or actually as additional sources of income, because they wanted to keep attachment to the home. And so while they had these new homes that were considered less at risk from a flooding and storm surge perspective because they were further off the coast, they didn't really take hold of their livelihoods in these new homes because there was such a strong attachment to the previous home. And it's not just the home, it's actually the literal proximity to the shoreline. And so because of the place attachment and the cultural and really ancestral ties to the sea, it didn't really work to dissipate the risk for these households. So I think, again, that's just one example, but when we consider support and at what levels and who needs to be involved, whether it's what types of stakeholders need to be involved, I think what it really comes down to is understanding what people value about their places in a changing climate and a changing environment.
Thank you, Nikki and Emma. I would also love to hear from Sophie on whether she has any examples on positive pathways from the ground and from her experience as well. Sophie, is there anything on this that you would like to talk to us about?
Yes, Estella, I would share a brief example on how the ministry, the Prime Minister's office, responsible for disaster risk management, is always trying to relocate people from one particular area in Uganda, around the Mount Elgon region, which always suffers from landslides during the rainy season. And when these people were given a permanent relocation, they were taken. So Mount Elgon is in eastern Uganda. These people are taken to western Uganda, which does not have mountains, does not have bamboo shoots, which they rely on for as a staple food and also as a source of income to sell and get livelihood. So after being relocated, they ended up returning back home. So they have the area in Western Uganda where they're relocated, which is safe and not risky, but they have to go back home because of the attachment. And they keep on staying there until there are warnings. And even sometimes during times when there are early warnings, these communities do not really listen in because they're so attached. They're like, we shall first see it happening before we actually run away. So I just wanted to share that story of the attachment to areas. Maybe if they were relocated to a place that is quite hilly, that they could experience the same, maybe they would not go back. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sophie. We have time for one last question. I would love to address this question to Lukman. And is Lukman, as more people move within their own countries into cities, is one of the findings that you discussed, Aniki, as well, from the regional shifts report. So as more people are moving towards cities, what are the most practical things that cities should be doing right now to prepare to receive these potential upcoming flows?
Thank you so much, Estella. I think cities are becoming a critical hub for climate in and out mobility. They are actually sending people out and they're also receiving people. So they're basically a major hub. But what can cities do? I think at the heart of it is to plan, and you cannot plan without the right knowledge. And that is why this kind of data that we produce from the GCM and other platforms so are very critical to help city to prepare. So you can only prepare if you have the right data to plan and anticipate. But also beyond anticipating also means that understanding where people would come from, where would they likely go, how can you reduce informal settlements, how can you also try as much as possible to plan your own urban, to do your urban planning in terms of so that it can also absorb the changing climate, right? So either it is flood, either it is rising heat. These are extremely important for cities to actually plan. But I think something that I also think cities can try to do is to start leveraging their agency as experts, but also as frontline actors to start influencing national policies, right? So because these are extremely important for them to be able to fund, to get the right resources in terms of funding, in terms of the policy, also legal frameworks. So they need to start leveraging their power of agency, of understanding what climate change or even mobility is, to support NAP in terms of national adaptation plans, to support NDCs, to support even the country's development plans, right? To ensure that climate change or climate mobility are integrated into this effort. I think these are critical roles that cities can do to prepare for climate mobility. But also, cities usually also, there are places that that host a lot of companies, private sectors that actually at times actually pollute the environment, or actually they can start leveraging the power of these private organizations to do some some adaptation efforts, right? So meaning that you do not only focus on national government, you have to also leverage the agency of private sector, the civil society, so that you can use these varying actors to drive meaningful actions on the ground, but also to support people that are coming into or people that are trapped in some of these areas. These are some of the action, and we have seen this either in Botswana, we are seeing it in Uganda, we are seeing it currently, we are in Liberia. We are also seeing what the cities are trying to do in Monrovia. We also have a partner city in Freetown, where they are doing a lot of nature-based solutions to address the issue of sea level rise and increasing flooding and flooding issues. So what I'm saying is cities have critical roles, and some cities are already doing it. And I think that's what our work, not just as GCCM, but also as other actors, to increasingly advance the voices of cities as global platforms, so that they can have platforms to share their work, but also their challenges, and they can get more partners. Thank you again. Over.
Thanks to you, Lukman. And again, thank you to all our speakers, our panelists, as well as discussants for taking the time to share this very insightful information with us. As the main takeaway from this session, I would just like to highlight the fact that those who need to decide and define what a positive pathway looks like are those in the front lines. They are the ones who have to have the last say, and is I think has been reiterated by all of our speakers. They have the last say on what a positive pathway and positive adaptation looks like. And this is why a participatory approach is key, and a community-led approach is key in both gathering the information that should inform any potential solution or pathway, as well as on deciding what solutions should be and how they can be better supported. So this is just, I guess, a takeaway that is very, very important for us that are in the field of providing support and facilitating these solutions, have to always keep in mind. Again, thanks to all of you, and thanks for all of the attendees and participants for joining this great session. I invite you to continue looking at the program and joining some of the other sessions that we have coming up today, as well as tomorrow. And with this, we will close this panel. Have a lovely day to all of you.